good for you. So, Mr. Patrick Chapin, go right ahead. Woo!
All right, hello. For anybody who might not know me, I'm Patrick Chapin. I am a Pro Tour player and a writer for Star City Games, and so the majority of my time is spent working on various Magic formats, trying to build the best decks for Type 2 Extended and sometimes Legacy or Block or whatever format is being played competitively. I guess as far as Standard with Conflux goes, I think that Conflux is one of the best sets in a long time for a variety of reasons. First of all, I think that Conflux is, obviously, I think it's a lot of fun, and there's a lot of interesting cards that kind of inspire me to, I want to experiment with this a little bit, I want to experiment with that a little bit. And the power level is definitely there, especially the deepness, because unlike Morningtide, which is one of the most, last year's most powerful set, or the last 12 months most powerful set, Morningtide was a little bit top heavy, where Bitterblossom and Revelark and Mutavault had a little bit more impact than like Obsidian, Battle Axe, and a lot of the other cards that were interesting, but not quite enough in that timeline. Conflux, on the other hand, is very, very deep because despite its relatively small size, I think at least a quarter of the cards are going to make an impact on Type 2. And that's a much higher percentage than a lot of sets. And I think that there's a lot of fringe cards too that have potential. So, but aside from cards like that that are just obviously geared to beat Faeries, a lot of the cards have Faeries in mind a little bit, which I think is important because Faeries is still the driving force behind Type 2. And I see so many people write about and talk about how Faeries is dead now. This time they're going to die. They can't beat Volcanic Fallout. Scattershot archers, there's too much hate. But the problem is that 95% of anything anybody would ever think to do in Type 2 is going to lose if they go Thoughtseize, Bitterblossom, Jace, Mistbind Click. Like, that progression of cards. And Faeries, that's what it tries to do. It just tries to disrupt you with the unfair tempo of Spellsetter Sprites and Mistbind Clicks. And so I think that anything you're thinking about playing in Type 2 really needs to begin with Faeries in mind. Why does your deck have a position in the metagame? Because it's not good enough to say, well, I can afford to lose one matchup, I'll lose to Faeries, and I'll just beat everything else. Because first of all, Faeries is a third of everything else anyway, so you're not really going to win a tournament if you can't beat Faeries. And second of all, Revelark already has that position in the metagame. There are Revelark decks that are very, very good against an awful lot of things that just can't beat Faeries. So if you're trying to build a deck that can't beat Faeries but supposedly beats everything else, the burden is on you to have a reason why your deck is better at doing this than Revelark. Because as you can say, as you guys remember, if you look back over the past, however long, Revelark has been a consistent player. It's always an option. But why doesn't anybody ever top 8 big events with Revelark, or win? When they do top 8, they don't win with Revelark. And that's because to build a Revelark deck that actually has a chance to beat Faeries, you end up losing a little bit of your percentage that you're supposed to have against everybody else. So I think that Revelark is a strategy to keep in mind because it has that nice spot of being so inherently strong against a lot of decks that are not Faeries. But if you're thinking about making a new deck, I think you got to start by thinking about what's my plan against Faeries. Maybe even more so before you figure out how you're going to win, because there are a lot of different incidental late game ways to win. Over the past few years, they've printed a lot of cards that can close a game out, whether it's Broodmate Dragon or Una, Queen of the Fae, or Garruk or Ajani or whatever planeswalker you want to use. So ending the game is not nearly as important as figuring out how to interact with Faeries. And I think that the primary ways to interact with Faeries, I think that it starts with just being willing to play a lot of cards that are good against Faeries. Because Silver Bullets don't work against a deck that has Remove Soul, Cryptic Command, Thoughtseize, Vendilion Click, Spellsetter Sprite. It's too likely that they will be able to stop you from doing whatever it is your one Silver Bullet is. And, if you're thinking like, oh, I'll put out Raking Canopy and they just won't be able to attack, well, obviously they have Cryptic Command, which they could bounce it eventually. So it's like, oh, so I can't use a permanent. All right? Well, what about Cloud Thresher? But then they have Remove Soul and Thoughtseize and Vendilion Click. So really what it comes down to is you have to be willing to play a lot of cards that can interact with Faeries in some way. And the biggest thing though is actually not just the Bitterblossom, because Bitterblossom is much easier to fight than Mistbind Click. The issue is Mistbind Click, because Mistbind Click completely invalidates decks that just play lots of sorceries. Like you can't just play a bunch of sorcery speed cards like creatures, enchantments, planeswalkers, and sorceries, because eventually somebody will just start Mistbind Clicking you. And if somebody's playing a 4/4 flyer that for 4 and time walking, like there's no possible sorceries you can be playing that are good enough that you can afford to just skip 2 turns to a top tier deck that time walks you. And so I think that you got to start looking with ways to interact with Mistbind Click. Like there's a lot of different ways you can play with removal, like Path to Exile or Terror. I think Path to Exile and Terror are just fantastic because when you Mistbind Click somebody, first of all, sometimes you can catch them where they only have the 1 fairy, like if they're just doing it off Immutable. And this happens more at lower levels of play because people will be greedy and just try to Mistbind Click just because they just want the extra turn. But at a higher level, what you can do is just when the champion is on the stack, obviously, Terror or Path to Exile the Mistbind Click, and then you'll have the luxury of all the rest of your mana to do whatever it is you were planning on. So you actually time walked the fairy deck. You know, they spent their whole turn doing something that didn't even work out. And I see a lot of people using Condemn, and I think Condemn is an amazing card. It's an amazing card, but it's not really well positioned in a format dominated by fairies, because condemning a Mistbind Click it's a little bit slow. You already lost your turn, you know? And that's if you have a land that comes into play untapped and makes white mana. And they don't have a Scion, you know? So I think Condemn is a premier sideboard card, but I think right now there's just too much of a fairy presence when you can be playing with other alternatives like Path to Exile and Terror. Now the nice thing about Path to Exile is that it does everything that all the different variants like Condemn and Terror and Bant Charm, and it does everything that all the other charms or all the other plow type cards do for the most part. Well, I guess it doesn't destroy artifacts, but it does it so cheap. But it has a drawback that makes it so that if you just blindly do it on the first few turns, it's going to set you way behind. But I think the real key to Path to Exile is that you can do it on your own creatures in opportune moments, like when you have a Tidehollow Scholar trigger on the stack, so as to remove their card forever, or evoked Moldrifter, he was going to die anyway, or if you sower somebody else's creature, if they kill your sower before you give their creature back, Path to Exile it. So I think that you want to really build, like when you're playing Path to Exile, I think you want to have it be part of your plan that in some way you're going to Path to Exile your own creature. Because if you look at Path to Exile, it's hard to tell how good it is to do it to your opponent's creatures sometimes. I mean, obviously you're like, oh, well, I'd love to do it to a Demigod of Revenge, but you would hate to do it to a Tattermunge Maniac. So sometimes the card can be kind of bad, sometimes it can be amazing. But when you think about it on your own creature, if you're ever in a situation where you were going to lose your guy anyway, or better still, you wish he was dead, then Path to Exiling it is just fantastic, because for 1 mana at instant speed you get a Rampant Growth. And I mean, I think Rampant Growth at 2 mana is pretty good, but at 1 mana instant speed Rampant Growth is just amazing to have as an option out of your removal spell. Like you can be playing a Control Mirror, and you can be sitting there with a whole bunch of Condemns in your hand, like, oh, this is just, you know, like, what good is Condemn? You know, by the time he starts hitting me with Broodmate Dragon, it'll be too late. But when you've Path to Exile, suddenly your Plume Veil has a new purpose in life. I mean, you'll have 5 mana in play. Your opponent will be like, oh, what's the worst he could do? He'll, you know, cast Moldrifter or something, and then on his end step, you flash down a Plume Veil, Path to Exile it. You'll get a 6th land in play immediately. Then you untap, play a 7th land, and Cruel Ultimatum them. So I think that having the access to instant speed Rampant Growths is just a fantastic option for your plow, you know? But I don't think Path to Exile is the only option, because I still think there are other good choices like Terror. Terror is a very overlooked card because it was bad for so long, and it's gotten better because of the fact that they've been printing more creatures that are worth terroring. You know, I mean, if the format is all creatures like Troll Ascetic or creatures like Moldrifter, then a 1-for-1 removal spell that doesn't even hit everything is a little bit limited. But right now there's just a lot of creatures that there's huge incentive to terror, particularly Figure of Destiny, Mutavault and Mistbind Click, but also, I mean, other things too, like Cloud Thresher or whatever, you know? So, some kind of a way to beat Mistbind Click. And some other ones I like are Flame Javelin is really good. Volcanic Fallout is fantastic. I mean, it's like the best anti-fairy card ever, but it's not good enough to just be your anti-Mistbind Click plan, because you still have to beat when they Mistbind Click their Bitterblossom. You know, I mean, sure, you get huge value, you sweep the board, you kill their Vendilion Click and 2 tokens, but if they keep time walking you, you can still lose. So, other options include Esper Charm. You gotta just be creative. Look at, like, you can go through whatever colors you're playing, do some sort of a search on Gather or something, and look for ways to deal 4 damage to a creature, or to do destroy target creature, destroy target non-black creature, put target creature on the bottom, destroy target flying creature, something. But you really, really, really need to be able to kill a Mistbind Click in response to the trigger. As far as the other cards that you need to be able to deal with, attacking Bitterblossom involves 2 primary different directions you can go. You can either be really aggressive and try to be faster than the Bitterblossom, which is a very viable strategy. I mean, you have to hit pretty hard to be faster than a Bitterblossom, because even if you're going turn 1 Noble Hierarch, turn 2 Dora and the Siege Tower, you're still getting force field by Bitterblossom, which buys them time to start doing things like Sower Temptation. So you have to be hitting pretty aggressively. But the other way you can go is to have a lot of card draw and board sweeps, because if you're playing with a lot of card draw, you can definitely outdraw Faeries. Now that they don't have Ancestral Vision, they have a real hard time keeping a lot of cards in their hand. If the game goes long, they just get stuck in a situation of drawing off the top, because none of their Faeries draw any cards. I mean, they have Jace Beleren, but you can address that card very specifically. Beyond Jace Beleren, they don't really have a lot of good options. I mean, they could try playing Fathom Troll or Tidings or Mindspring or Courier Capsule or a lot of different things, but at the end of the day, if they spend their mana drawing extra cards, it's better for you anyway, because Faeries' whole game is a tempo game. You cannot beat Faeries on tempo alone, so you have to try to find some other way to combat them. And if you're not going to beat them down aggressively, then I think you have to try to just draw more cards than them. And that's why so often, like Wafotapa, Booker, myself, at Worlds, we discovered when playtesting for Worlds that Esper Charm was a lie. Like, Esper Charm is a trick. Esper Charm is awesome against Faeries, but that's because drawing 2 cards is like the best thing you can do against Faeries. So we just found that, you know, we played all these games, and we would be Esper Charming the Bitterblossom, and it would, at the end of the game, Faeries would crawl its way back and end up beating you with a Scion and a Mutavault, and you know, they counter 1 too many spells, and you'd be like, what happened? Why did I run out of gas? And it's because you can't afford to just not draw extra cards. Now, if your hand is Muldrifter, Esper Charm, or Courier Capsule, Muldrifter, Esper Charm, then sure, you know, you have much more, you know, time to use it as a disenchant. But for the most part, if your deck is built right, I think that drawing 2 cards can often be better than destroying an opponent's Bitterblossom, because if you destroy their Bitterblossom, it turns every other Bitterblossom in their deck into an amazing card, right? Like, if you destroy their Bitterblossom, every time if they have any Bitterblossoms in their hand, they now have the best possible card in their hand. Whereas if you draw 2, not only do you have 2 more cards to try to win the game with, but every other Bitterblossom they have is much, much weaker, possibly actively bad, because, I mean, in my experience, a lot of decks that would use Esper Charm, if the opponent plays a second Bitterblossom, it's usually a death sentence anyway. It usually means they're desperate, because you can just sweep the board a couple times and they'll fall so far behind in life they can't win. So I think that you have to be careful, because Esper Charming a Bitterblossom is still an option. You know, particularly when you're on the play and you know he can't Scion, or if he mulliganed, or if you have plenty of extra card draw in your hand, or whatever. But when you're playing, make a real conscious effort to consider, might it be better to not destroy the Bitterblossom and instead draw 2 cards? Because there's so many other implications, you know. The 2 cards could be a Cloud Thresher and a Volcanic Fallout, or a Cryptic Command and another Esper Charm. So drawing 2 cards is like one of the best things you can possibly do. As far as combating the Bitterblossom token generating aspect, I think Volcanic Fallout is, bar none, the best anti-fairy card in Standard since Bitterblossom existed. I think that the key to Volcanic Fallout is that it is the best aspects of a lot of good cards against fairies. It has Esper Charm's ability to sweep at instant speed and hit Mutavaults. It has Cloud Thresher's ability to be a main deckable card that is easily cast for most decks. Cloud Thresher is pretty easily cast, but it is direct damage to help keep their life total down. It combats Jace Valerian, which is one of their other great tools, because if they draw a card immediately off Jace, now it gives you an answer to that. It makes it so they can't just keep going on the man-land plan where they have nothing but Fairy Conclaves and Mutavaults, where sometimes you'll sort of stabilize, but then you'll have to deal with 3 Mutavaults and a Fairy Conclave. You can keep them honest where they can only attack you with 1 creature per turn, because if they lose 2 Mutavaults at the same time to a Volcanic Fallout, their mana base is going to be crippled, you know? And you can also exploit the fact that they're now going to have to attack you with 1 creature by using cards like Plume Veil, you know? Plume Veil is hugely overlooked, and I know that it's much better in like 5-color control strategies than in just some, you know, in some random other deck. But to give you an idea how serious we are about Plume Veil, I think that you can try Plume Veil in a lot of other decks. Like Manuel Booker's last Fairy deck he built had 3 Plume Veils in it because he was having trouble with some people who built some really hyper-aggressive beatdown decks, and Plume Veil was the perfect solution. Plus, it was great in the mirror. I mean, Plume Veil is almost as good as a Cloud Thresher against fairies, and it's pretty freaking good against other people too, like against a White Winnie deck or just about anything short of a Doran the Siege Tower, you know? But I digress. So against fairies, the Volcanic Fallout, it's uncounterable. They can't interact with it with any of their typical disruption beyond discard. It can just sit in your hand for a long time, because when the fairy player knows you have it, like if they thought sees you and your hand has 2 Fallouts, or if your hand has Cryptic Command Fallout, then they're put in a real tough spot, because if they take your Fallout, they have to leave you with all the cards like Muldrifter, Esper Charm, and Cryptic Command, which really generate you action early. And if they take the cards that generate action early, then you get to sit with this ace that you're just holding over their head, and it forces them to slow their game way down, because they can't just go, Venturion click, Scion, attack with all my guys, you know, there's always this risk of this blowout that they cannot counter. And you can Volcanic Fallout in response to a Spellstutter sprite, so that its ability fizzles. You can, I mean, Volcanic Fallout literally does almost everything you could want against fairies. But again, even if you play 3 or 4 Volcanic Fallouts, you're not going to draw it all the time. You know, you're not going to, and if you play it, you're not going to automatically win. I mean, it's always great against them, but it's not a game winner. It's not the type of card that's like Crovax, where they cannot win anymore. I mean, you have to actually work. So while you're buying yourself all this time, you want to figure out what it is you're doing with this time. Like, how are you drawing extra cards? How are you planning on closing out the game? You know, you can win with there's a million ways to win in Type 2 right now. You can have Broodmate Dragon, or Cruel Ultimatum, or Nikobol's Planeswalker, or Banefire, or a whole bunch of other Planeswalkers. But whatever it is you're doing with the time, you really want to make sure that that you're taking advantage of it, and in particular, drawing extra cards. And I'll get to the drawing extra cards in a minute, but the other cards of fairies that you really need to combat are Cryptic Command and Jace Valerian. Now, as far as Jace Valerian goes, Jace, if your deck attacks, if your deck has, you know, if your deck has at least 16 to 20 creatures that don't have Defender, then you already have a plan against Jace. Assuming that the rest of your deck operates correctly, you should be able to put enough pressure on fairies that their Jace isn't very good. But if your deck is not an attacking creature sort of deck, or doesn't have a lot of direct damage, then you have to look to other options, like Volcanic Fallout's one nice one, but also cards like Cloud Thresher, Banefire. You can have various forms of bounce, but it's really tricky, because if you're not playing a dedicated burn deck, finding answers to Jace is I mean, I personally build lots of decks that just end up losing to Jace, so I sympathize, but I think you got to just keep in mind that you want to have some way to attack, and Rock's Warmonk is not the answer. so many people always resort to Rock's Warmonk. Like they'll cut Plume Veil and they'll be like, oh, it's personal preference. I think Rock's Warmonk, in my meta, Rock's Warmonk is better. But if your meta involves Rock's Warmonk being better than Plume Veil, then your meta is probably 85% 5-color control and 10% all Planeswalker decks. Because if you just put the two cards head to head, it becomes very, very apparent of why Plume Veil is so much better. First of all, Plume Veil is easier to cast because even though it's also a triple color requirement, it's all blue. I mean, anybody who would be considering a Rock's Warmonk or a Plume Veil defensively can you not produce triple blue all the time? Whereas Rock's Warmonk doesn't interact with cards like Sunken Ruins very well. And in addition, Plume Veil is bigger, which is very, very relevant because a 4/4 versus a 3/4 is just about the biggest difference in Type 2. Because, Rock's Warmonk is kind of continually reminded of cards like Mistspine Click, Demigod of Revenge, Figure of Destiny as a 4/4, Ashenmoor Gouger. That's the magic number. Like way, way, way back in the day, one of the early things about Magic Theory was that creatures with a 3 toughness were bad because Lightning Bolt was in the format. And back then they said, well, you shouldn't be playing with Phantom Monster because it's just going to get hit by a Lightning Bolt. That's why Azure Drake is so much better. But now the magic number is 4/4 because, or at least 4/3, because the toughness needs to be big enough to live through Volcanic Fallout, but the power needs to be big enough to rumble with cards like Demigod and Figure and Mistspine Click and all those cards. So Rock's Warmonk is just the exact definition of a little too small, and Plume Veil is just big enough. In addition, Flying and Flash are obviously fantastic abilities. Don't you? If you're looking for a creature to interact with Faeries, it'd be kind of nice if it flew, right? And then Flash lets you fight Mistspine Click. It gives you something to do on your upkeep that can undo the damage done. Plume Veil interacts with Mutavault so much better because your opponent just will try to get that free shot against you and you can force a battle on his turn. That's one of the big things about Plume Veil is that if your opponent just plays out a random Scion or just a Spellstutter Sprite just to start beating down, or just even Bitterblossom tokens, if you Plume Veil during their attack phase, knowing that they could fight you and win, you put them in a really, really horrible position because if they fight you and win, they're tapped out so that you can untap and do something really devastating, A lot of Fairy decks can't actually afford to be hit by a Cruel Ultimatum or a Broodmate Dragon. If you can just get them to tap out on their turn, so then Fairies is stuck in the position of, well, I didn't really want to lose my Scion, but I have to give it to you because if I tap out on my turn, you'll wreck me on your turn. And so then, not only did you kill the Scion, giving you card advantage, you now have a Plume Veil sitting in play, which is more powerful than any permanent they can muster short of a Bitterblossom. And it can buy you time against a Bitterblossom. What's a Rock's Warmonk do? Yes, if you play it and continue to attack, you can win a race somehow, but they can block with Bitterblossom tokens, and if they have Agony Warp, the blocking with a Bitterblossom is naturally good anyway. And as anybody who watched Jamie Park at the World Championships could see, he lost the finals of the World Championships because his Rock's Warmonk didn't have the special ability of Defender. He played Rock's Warmonk against the Faeries player, and Anti-Malwin just played Sower of Temptation, took it, and started beating him down. If you're playing with creatures, if you're trying to play a game that wins with late game bombs, you're not trying to win with 3-drop creatures. That's not there's no compelling reason why a 3-drop creature instead of a 2-drop creature, a 4-drop creature, a 5-drop. There's no compelling reason unless the card was just ideal to win with. And in Type 2 right now, the playing random creatures that get Path to Exiled is not an inevitable game plan. That's not how you can for sure lock out a long game, So if you play a Rock's Warmonk, you have to deal with the fact that it's smaller, harder to cast, it doesn't have Flying and Flash, and I think Flying and Flash is better than Lifelink. Don't get me wrong, I love Lifelink, but how often does the extra life just prove irrelevant compared to whenever you play Plume Veil, it's a blowout. There's so many people who just, if you have Plume Veil, they cannot win because you 1/8/7 their guy in combat, often with a gain of value in mana, and then you have sitting in play a creature that's bigger than anything they're going to produce. And then, as I said, I think Defender is a really underrated special ability. Like, it's the insane thing about Plume Veil is that it's a 4/4 for 3, and typically 4/4s for 3 have to have some great drawback, like Ashmore Gouger not being able to block. But since Plume Veil's blue, it just gets 3 great special abilities: Flying, Flash, and Defender. So, I think Plume Veil is one of the 5 best creatures in the format and should be explored more. Anyway. So when you're looking at ways to interact with fairies, Bitterblossom, Jace, Cryptic Command, and Mistspine Click are the primary ones you have to deal with. Cryptic Command is the next one I haven't addressed. Cryptic Command is not just the best card in fairies, but it's the best card in the format by a mile. It's way better than all the other cards, and the entire format revolves around it. I think that the only 2 types of decks are Cryptic Command decks and decks that wish they had Cryptic Command. I mean, Cryptic Command is so much better than any of the other cards that you have to look at every single card you're thinking about playing and put it in the head-to-head against Cryptic Command. You know, like for instance, all right, Thornling. You know, Thornling's really good, but you know he Cryptic Commands it, so I lose a mana and he draws a card. Oh, okay, so, and then you quickly realize that you can't actually play anything that costs 4 or more without having a very good reason, because you're always just going to lose to Cryptic Command. Now, 4 mana you can at least play in your own turn, you know, if you're on the play or whatever. But in order to justify any card that costs 5 or more, you have to have a really compelling reason to do so. You have to have a way to interact with the person in such a way so that you know you're not going to just get blown out by Cryptic Command. You know, like I think Primal Command is a fantastic card, and I think Broodmate Dragon is a fantastic card, and I think that Cruel Ultimatum is, it's a fantastic card. Violent Ultimatum even. There's no end of things you could do. But in order to play those type of things, you have to have enough instance that you can fight, you can start fights on your opponent's turn. You know, if you have like Thoughtseize or Tidehollow Sculler or some way to interact with their hands so that you know you're not going to get blown out by a Cryptic Command, or if you have Negate or Bant Charm so you can fight a Cryptic Command battle, you know, those are all viable options also. But if you're just playing with expensive cards that do some great thing, you need to have enough ways to pick fights in your opponent's turn so that you can put them in a compromised position, so that should you ever get a chance to play a spell unmolested on your turn, then it will be great. But like cards like Broodmate Dragon and Cruel Ultimatum aren't that good against fairies because they're all things that get countered, you know? And when you're building your deck, you have to be very, very careful not to fill your deck with cards that lose to Cryptic Command, because they're going to have it a lot of the time, and eventually they're going to draw it. And Cryptic Command has other implications too, like you can't rely on just blocking creatures forever. You know, like a Plume Veil is just a 1-to-1 type of situation, so that if they should ever tap it with Cryptic Command, it's not that significantly different than if they bounce a creature. But if your plan is to tie up the ground with a whole bunch of creatures, you always have to be aware that eventually they're going to just falter you. They're just going to tap all your guys, and then you're going to die in combat. And you have to be very careful about the Cryptic Command bouncing a land. So you have to have a plan in your deck. Like, is your deck going to fall apart if the other person just Cryptic Commands your land on the 4th turn if he's on the play? So, I'm sure it's no surprise, but you have to be able to play cards in the first few turns of the game. Because if you fall behind against fairies even one step, you will normally never recover, because they'll just start time walking you every turn one way or the other, whether it's Vendilion Click or Mistspine Click or Spellsitter Sprite. Alright, enough about specifically targeting the power cards out of fairies. I think that you kind of want to, first you have to ask yourself when building a deck, what is your deck even doing? Like, what's its niche? What's the purpose of this deck right now? Because fairies is already better than most things that people are playing. What position does this deck have? Let's say you've got some plans against fairies and you think you can hang, you can win at least half the time or 60% of the time or whatever against fairies. What is your deck doing? Like for instance, Revelark is a card that's far more powerful than most of the other cards in the format. And as a result, you can build different decks around it where Revelark will bring the value up of all the other cards in your deck. And it gives you something that, what is your plan against an unknown opponent? Well, if I play a Revelark, I bet they lose. I bet they are yet another person who can't beat a Revelark in play. Cruel Ultimatum is another card that if people get hit by a Cruel Ultimatum, they're usually going to die. And Bitterblossom, obviously the majority of people who use Bitterblossom are going to use it in Faeries, but the card can go in a number of other applications, like black-white tokens, you know? So try to identify what powerful cards your deck has and what it is you're trying to get to. I guess I'd like to take a minute to talk about some of the existing decks in Type 2 and how they might have changed as a result of Conflux. At Worlds, the most popular deck was Faeries, and I don't think Faeries gets anything new from this set. I mean, Counter Squall is an option, but I think that the primary changes as a result of Conflux are the moving away from Agony Warp towards cards like Terror and Pepper Smoke. And I think that you want a little bit more creature removal than you did before, because I think there's going to be a little bit less token generation and a little bit more creatures that are devastating to you. And Terror has advantages like killing other people's Mistbind clicks, killing Plume Veils, killing Figure of Destiny when you fall behind, and it's easier on your mana. I mean, it's funny, but one of Faeries' Achilles' heels is that its mana base is suspect. You know, it's only 2 colors. In order to have good mana in this format, you have to play all 5. But the Pepper Smokes, I think, are a concession to the fact that Noble Hierarch exists. Because I think the Figure of Destiny, Birds of Paradise, Scion of Una, Vendilion Click, I mean, there's lots of good 1-drops, you know? I mean, Pepper Smoke, or 1-toughness creatures. Pepper Smoke is a great anti-fairy card for this exact reason, in that it's the exact right way to fight fairy creatures in a 1-to-1 type of situation. But now that Noble Hierarch exists, Noble Hierarch is a real contender for one of the 5 most powerful cards in the set. Not set, 5 most powerful cards in the format. Like, I think Cryptic Command, and then Bitterblossom and Revelarch are at the top. But beyond those, I think that Noble Hierarch might be number 4, at least as far as cards that are not land go. And Noble Hierarch is better than Birds of Paradise, in my opinion. Not just, and I don't think it's strictly better, because obviously if your deck needs black or red mana, then Birds of Paradise has a huge advantage. But if you just put them head to head, the Exalted is such a more powerful ability on a 1-drop, especially a 1-drop that doesn't want to attack, that often Noble Hierarch will be as aggressive as a Mox Jet, and as a Mox Ruby and a Jackal Pup. I mean, it's like the best thing you could do on turn 1, because if you lead with Noble Hierarch into Bogart Ram Gang, or Noble Hierarch into Rox Warmonk, or Noble Hierarch into Doran the Siege Tower, the other person's got 1 land in play, and you're already hitting him with 4 points of haste, or you have a Doran in play that is for sure going to bash through anything you could possibly do. So the fact that it provides a 1-drop accelerating color fixer that gives combat bonuses and speeds up the clock and can attack on its own, and I mean, Noble Hierarch is going to be one of the defining cards because it's just so aggressively costed. And if a Faeries player is playing against a Noble Hierarch player, having access to Pepper Smoke allows you to often, more or less, win the game on the first turn, because in my experience, the majority of Noble Hierarch decks are the type of deck that when they have Noble Hierarch, their deck is better than their opponents, and when they don't have Noble Hierarch, their deck is worse than their opponents. And it doesn't even just have to be Noble Hierarch, sometimes it's Birds of Paradise, but if you lead with a Pepper Smoke on that, these decks are usually engineered to go from 1 to 3, because once you have Birds and Noble Hierarchs in your deck, you can reliably skip the 2-drop, because very few people can deal with a Noble Hierarch on turn 1, which then in turn makes the Pepper Smoke a much more appealing option. And even against a control player, the fact that it cycles lets you get extra value out of it. But beyond Pepper Smoke and Terror replacing Agony Warp, most of the cards I would advocate in Faeries are pretty standard. I think most people are going to play something along the lines of like 4 of all the good cards, like Spellstutter Sprite, Mistbind Click, Cryptic Command, and Bitterblossom. And then you play a couple, depending on what you're trying to gear the deck against, out of cards like Sower, or Scion, or Vendilion Click, or Jace, or Thoughtseize. And I don't love Thoughtseize. I think a lot of people always jump to put a ton of Thoughtseizes in their deck. But I think that now that the format is not all Fairy Mirrors, the value of Thoughtseize goes way down, because I think that the only place where Thoughtseize really, really shines in a Fairy deck is against a Fairy deck, taking another Bitterblossom. Because like when you're playing this 5-color control, all their they have so many good cards that often thought seizing them doesn't. It's just a 1-for-1 that you losing 2 life is really relevant, and you tapping mana on your own turn is relevant, and the information is really nice, but they're going to draw so many more cards than you that they can get out of the disruption. Whereas if you're trading all your cards to 1-for-1 with them, you don't have any way to get back ahead. You know. I think that Fairy Conclave needs to be kept in moderation. You can't really afford to have a lot of comes into play tap lands in a Fairy deck right now. But I think 0 to 2 is 0, 1, or 2 are all viable options. And then beyond that, just make sure you have plenty of basics, like at least 3 swamps and 5 islands or something. There really isn't a lot of cards in Fairies, which I think is a blessing for a lot of players because you don't have another thing to deal with. You know, Fairies isn't getting worse. It's just getting it stays the same, and it just becomes a question of how everyone else positions themselves. The second most popular. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
You don't foresee any white splash in Fairies in the future, then?
Well, no, that's actually a very good idea. I wasn't counting that as the primary archetype, but that's more of a fringe strategy. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that's going to emerge much more so now because some people have been experimenting with adding either red or adding white to Fairies. First of all, the mana is a little bit easier because of the tri-lands and the fact that and second of all, there's gold cards that are friendly to those colors because those are shards. And there's some really appealing options in both. Now, I don't think that's going to take over as the mainstream. I think that the mainstream is still going to be blue-black because it's known, it's tested and tried and understood. But I think that there is definitely potential for ambitious Fairies players to add white cards like, first of all, Esper Charm as an option because it helps give you a draw engine. I mean, Muldrifter is a very unappealing draw engine for a Fairy player because they don't want to tap mana on their own turn. Esper Charm plays right into your game plan perfectly. Plus, I mean, in Fairies, Esper Charming somebody's Bitterblossom is actually fantastic because the entire matchup revolves around Fairies, or revolves around Bitterblossom. And in addition to Esper Charm, there's nice options like there's a new card that is 1 and a white. Does anybody know the name of it? That
Mark of Asylum?
Yeah, Mark of Asylum, that prevents all damage, all non-combat damage to your creatures, which in one fell swoop invalidates Cloud Thresher and Volcanic Fallout and things like that. But I think it's really risky to rely on that card because a lot of other people will just Esper Charm it and then blow you out with a sweeper.
Or just use Infest.
What's that?
Or just use Infest.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. Infest, a lot of people are going to be using anyway because there's going to be such a prevalence of Forge Tenders as a result of the Fallout existing. In addition, Path to Exile is a really powerful card that can fight for that terror spot, you know? And it gives you nice answers to cards like Doran, which people might be adopting heavy. And in addition, there's Celestial Purge as a sideboard card. I think Celestial Purge is a really non-intuitive sideboard card because a lot of people think you're supposed to use it against Fairies and red decks because it says black and red, you know, it kills Bitterblossom and red creatures. But I think it's actually supposed to be against red decks and White Weenie because against Fairies, destroying a Bitterblossom is often not the best thing, not the right battle to be picking, and they have no other black permanents. Now, this is obviously different if they have Liliana or something, but for the most part, they don't have a lot of other black permanents. And again, Scepter of Foog is an exception. If people start adapting Scepter of Foog, then it becomes much better. But against red, it's obvious that plowing all their creatures is the best thing you can be doing. But against white, their best cards are Ajani Vengeant and Figure of Destiny for the most part. You know, some people still play mono white, but an awful lot of people have moved towards Ajani Vengeant and Figure of Destiny, and it's nice that Celestial Purge can interact with that. So I think there are a variety of different white cards that can be explored, and I'm sure that there's others if you just scour the Esper Shard looking for answers, but the burden is on you to come up with a reason to justify playing with all these lands that come into play tapped, because once you build a deck that's not 2 colors, then your deck, or based around Noble Hierarch, then your deck has to justify the fact that it's going to go turn 1 Arclet Sanctum, you know, or Vivid Creek, because there's no good, the lands do not exist to play 3-color without lands that come into play tapped, unless you're playing like a Birds of Paradise Noble Hierarch type of thing. So I think if you can justify the fact that you have to reimagine the deck so that your mana curve works out better, but if you can do that, then I think that's worth exploring. You know, it's definitely something to consider, and that might be the future for Faeries, because it might make you much more resilient to the hate. As far as red goes, red, the most appealing things are, in my opinion, Cruel Ultimatum and Banefire, which are kind of non-intuitive cards for a fairy deck. But let's suppose you're thought seizing somebody, you're Vendilion clicking somebody, you're Mistbind clicking somebody. That's a lot of ways to set up a window where you can do something on your turn, right? Because most people, when they combat fairies, figure, if I can just get them to tap out on their turn, then I can do what I want. So they continually tap out on their own turn, trying to fight the fairies player. And the fairies player can actually fight battles very, very easily on the opponent's turn with Mistbind click and Vendilion click and whatnot. And as soon as they have a window, just hit them with Cruel Ultimatum and they die, you know? Because as good as Cruel Ultimatum is in a 5-card control deck, I assure you, when a fairy player Cruel Ultimatum you, you're going to die. So, the whole problem with Cruel Ultimatum is that you have to be really thinking long term, because a lot of Fairies decks have trouble getting up to 7 mana because they're not playing with all the Courier's Capsules and the Mole Drifters and things like that. And it's just not realistic to play with a deck with 30 land in it right now, or 31 land in it. So, if you were going to go down that road, you would need to play a lot more card draw in your Fairy deck. And then I think Banefire is just a really nice direction to take Fairies, because lots of times Fairies can get so much tempo early that having a finisher that can close out the game can be really nice. And Banefire there is not particularly better than any other Fireball, but it just happens to be the best one available right now. And it's also nice to be able to interact with Planeswalkers and to win the mirror because you're doing extra damage. So I think there's a variety of different ways to explore Fairies, but I don't think that it's going to become the mainstream to add the third color. The second most popular deck at Worlds was Black-White Tokens. And I think Black-White Tokens has lost a lot of popularity since then, because I think it was one of those decks that became the it fad for, 1 week before the tournament. Suddenly everyone's talking about this new deck, like, oh wow, this deck is actually good. Other people aren't going to be ready for it, but everybody was ready for it because everyone actually thought that they had it and that nobody else did. And so the problem with the Black-White token deck is that once you analyze how it's attacking you, you can very easily specifically target those things. Now, to give it to anybody who might not be familiar with this Black-White token deck, it uses discard like Tidehowl's Scholar and Thoughtseize as a minimum amount of disruption, but for the most part it plays cards like Special Procession and Bitterblossom and Marsh Flitter and Cloudgoat Ranger to consistently play 3 threats at once, which become much, much, much stronger when combined with the fact that the deck has Glorious Anthem, Ajani, the Gold Mane, and Windbrush Heights, and a variety of cards that just really, really, really reward you for having a bunch of creatures. And the thing about the deck is that all it really does is provide us a token amount of disruption, like a small amount of disruption with Terror and Thoughtseize and Sculler. But for the most part, it just tries to go, all right, I'm going to play a whole bunch of guys and power them up, and you're going to have to deal with it, but that's okay, because then I'll play a whole bunch more guys. And each one of its cards gives it this sort of implied card advantage, because each one of its creatures is giving you 3 creatures. Now, the problem with this deck is that it's sort of, it becomes a little bit of a, well, it really lacks ways to fight specific problems. It really is just, I'm going to hope you can't beat what I do. Because all it does is the same thing. It just plays out a bunch of tokens and powers them up. And I think from the new set, this is another deck that doesn't gain a ton. I think you can consider Path to Exile. And it's cute that you can Path to Exile your Tidehowler or Sculler to ramp up. But the problem with Path to Exile in this deck is that this deck really wants to use its Terror on its opponent's creatures. And when you're Thoughtseizing somebody, when you're Tidehowler Scullering somebody, you don't really want to give them an extra land to solve their problems with, So I think this is one deck that isn't really going to gain a lot either. But as far as new cards against it, Volcanic Fallout is a fantastic way to fight it, because once again, it's a board sweeper that you can play a whole bunch of main, but it can keep the Planeswalkers down a little bit, often killing a Ajani Goldmane in response to the second pump. The more interesting decks to change, I think, are, 3 through 5 or whatever. Once you start getting down to like 5-color control. 5-color control benefits more than I think any other existing deck, because 5-color control is basically just the good cards. It's just, the theory is that, alright, in exchange for 12 of our lands coming into play tapped, we can play anything. And in this set, there are some good anythings, all of which I guess Progenitus has protection from. But if you have access to all the colors of mana, you can play. You start looking through all the colors. Red obviously screams out at you with Volcanic Fallout, because it's a beautiful way to change your Pyroplasm to another card that does mostly the same things, but allows you to interact with Faeries in a very, very, very powerful way, whereas Pyroplasm was always a very weak card against Faeries. The other red card I really like in the set for 5-color is Banefire. Now I don't know if it's actually right to play it, but I think it's worth considering, because 5-color is the exact type of deck that can just lay out tons of land over time. You end up with 12 land, you end up with 15 land, and Banefire is a pretty good thing to do with 15 land. And it helps deal with planeswalkers, and it's just a better victory condition than creatures, because of the fact that Path to Exile invalidates creatures as a win option for the most part. And what creature are you going to win with that beats Path to Exile? And I'm sure you can think of some creature with Shroud, but are you really going to want to win with an Inkwell Leviathan? Like, is that what it's come to? So I think that just planning on Una, Queen of the Fae, is not real, because Una dies to Path to Exile, let alone Celestial Purge. As far as white goes, Path to Exile is a very good option. Now, I think you want to be careful about just throwing 4 into every deck, but I think that, especially when you consider the Plume Veil and Muldrifter to combo with it, the Path to Exile is a very exciting option, because it addresses so many things, like Demigod of Revenge, Figure of Destiny, Mistbind Click. I mean, and if you don't play with it, you're going to be that guy who loses to somebody's Thornling. Thornling is in any other day and time, Thornling would be amazing. Its abilities are better than Morphlings for the most part, and it's bigger. And it's a color that actually would love to have a creature, but it can't beat Plow, So as a result, Morphling would be better in this format, just because its one ability is what this format calls for. So you don't want to be that guy losing to Thornling. Play a little bit. You got to stay honest. You got to play some number of Path to Exiles. Another white card I think is exciting is Martial Coup, and I am not sure that I don't think 5-color is necessarily the home for it, because you have to really look at Martial Coup as a 7-mana spell that has other options. But at 7 mana, obviously the comparison is Cruel Ultimatum, and Martial Coup could be better in a format where everybody's producing tons and tons of tokens, but beyond that, if you Martial Coup people, it's very realistic that they can beat you, whereas most people can't beat a Cruel Ultimatum. That said, Martial Coup is yet another great thing to do when you have 12 or 13 land, so if you sit there with a whole bunch of mana, it can be like a Banefire, and it certainly beats Path to Exile. So I think that Martial Coup is a card that's worth exploring, but perhaps it is better suited in a deck that doesn't have access to Cruel Ultimatum, some deck that can't actually support it. I think Celestial Purge is a fantastic sideboard card that has the possibility of being main deckable, because it deals with things in everybody's deck. You don't want it against Faeries, but if you play against Faeries, you can actually hit a Bitterblossom. If you play against White Weenie, it hits their best cards, Figure and Ajani. It hits against a Noble Hierarch deck, it hits Bogart Ramgang or Doran or whatever they might be playing. As far as new blue cards go, blue didn't really gain a whole lot from this set. So I think that the most notable thing I would keep in mind is that cards like Courier's Capsule need to be really appreciated, need to be looked at more, because Courier's Capsule is a much maligned card that everybody respects in Limited. Everybody loves drawing extra cards in Limited, but in Constructed it's actually deceptively good, because decks that would be playing Courier's Capsule are typically the type of decks that have every good 3-drop in the world. There's no shortage of good 3-drops, like Muldrifter, Esper Charm, Volcanic Fallout, Plume Veil, Rockswarm, whatever it is that you think, Jace, whatever you want to play on 3. But what are you doing on 2 that's proactive? Is Path to Exile really what you want to do on turn 2? You know, you want to have something to do on turn 2 to progress your game plan, and if you play Courier's Capsule, it gives you value out of your second turn. That's still good later. Like, Courier's Capsule is a fine card on turn 7, let alone turn 2. So it's good at any point in the game. Second of all, these type of decks often leave mana open on their opponent's turn, which then lets you get value out of that by, when you have time, activate the capsule. You know? So it's sort of free on the way in and free on the way out if you are just careful about when if you're careful in your deck design. The big benefit, the secret hidden third reason why I think Courier's Capsule is so important and will rise in value in terms of its tournament playability is that with these types of decks, I think one of the biggest ways you can lose is by keeping a 2-card hand and not drawing a land. You know, like, I mean, how many times do you look at your hand and you have 2 land and you're on the play, and you obviously keep it, it's a great hand, and all you got to do is draw a land on the second turn or the third turn. You have 2 shots to draw land, but the problem is even if your deck has 26, 27 land in it, you're still, there's a decent chance, there's like a 1 in 4 shot-ish that you're not going to be able to hit your third land drop, which will often cost you the game. So Courier's, please go ahead.
About 5 minutes.
Oh, absolutely. Courier's Capsule is a fantastic way to ensure that you hit your third land drop. You know, I mean, if you keep a 2-land hand with Courier's Capsule, it's as good as gold, because if you don't hit your third land drop naturally, then you can just crack the capsule and dig for it. As far as black cards in the new set go, for a 5-color, Scepter of Foog is a good one to explore. Beyond that, I think that the other options are really more for new deck types, you know? Green, I don't think really offers a lot for 5-color decks these days, but I guess I'd just like to, if we have 5 minutes left, highlight some other cards that I think are interesting and worth exploring in the new set. I think that Nicol Bolas is flashy and exciting, and on first glance, you're like, oh, this could be so powerful, but then when you look at it deeper, you're like, oh, but it's not as good as Cruel Ultimatum. But it does actually have the potential to go somewhere, because there are some people that can beat a Cruel Ultimatum, and those people usually can't beat a Nicol Bolas. So it's possible that a metagame could exist. Like, for instance, Cruel Ultimatum is pretty horrible against a Revelar deck a lot of the time, because their board will just get worse for you. Nicol Bolas, on the other hand, take control of the Revelar, you know. So I think that Keteric Parasite is probably not going to get there because I think that it's just another card that dies to Volcanic Fallout, and I think that Master Transmuter is a very, very powerful card that is another card that dies to Volcanic Fallout, and Thornling is a very, very powerful card that dies to Path to Exile. But I think that as long as you just keep in mind Faeries and keep in mind the new cards like Volcanic Fallout and Path to Exile, you can filter through which of the new cards should be explored a little heavier. You know, like Wall of Reverence is kind of exciting, because if you combine it with Cloud Thresher or Plume Veil, you can just blow them out really, really, really fast. And a 1/6 flyer is perfectly equipped to block demigods or figures or Spectral Procession tokens or Bitterblossom tokens or whatever. When looking at the new set, yeah, go ahead.
What's your opinion on the 5/3 conditional haste lifelink dude?
Well, there's a couple things I like about that guy, and that's that, first of all, he has 3 toughness, which I think is an ideal number, and second of all, he has haste, and I think haste is a really important ability right now. But the things I don't like about him are you have to have a red creature permanent. You know, you don't really need a lifelink with that guy, because that's not what you're paying for. You're paying for the haste. And I think that you have to have a number of ways to play cards that are not going to get blown out by Volcanic Fallout. But if your deck is full of Bogart Raingangs and Woolly Thocters, then that guy's a very real option, you know, because he does what you need done. He can sneak under a Cryptic Command sometime, and if he hits them, start punishing them. I think he's definitely worth considering, you know.
So you don't think that there will be a deck that'll come out like Figure of Destiny and that guy and?
Oh, sure. I think that's definitely a way to explore. I think that's absolutely. I think that if you're going to go down that road, make sure you have plenty of red permanents. You know, like obviously it's nice to have the Figure of Destiny or the Woolly Thocter or any other white like kitchen finks, I don't know, anything like that. But at the end of the day, to make that guy work, you need to have a red permanent.
Yeah.
And I think it's really, that's a viable option, but remember, you have to decide if that's better than the other 4-drops, which it might be. I mean, the 4-drops aren't that insane right now. I mean, Chameleon Colossus is long dead because it gets blown out by Path to Exile, and protection from black is not what you want to pay for right now. Yeah, any other questions?
What about Orchard?
The Scattershot Archer, yes. I think the Scattershot Archer has several applications to it.
Orchard.
What's that?
Exotic Orchard.
Oh, the Exotic Orchard?
Yeah.
Alright, the Exotic Orchard. Exotic Orchard is a card that is not quite as good as many people think, but it's better than other people think, because I think, which is the most useful thing I've said all day, I'm sure. The thing about Exotic Orchard is that you have to really think about what you're doing with unreliable mana, because in my experience, typically an Exotic Orchard is either red or white, or it's an Underground Seed. So you have to ask yourself, is your deck the type of deck that would benefit from having either red or white mana or an Underground Sea? And that's kind of a complex question to ask yourself, because when you have mana that doesn't reliably produce the colors you need, you really need to be using it because of the fact that you just know you're going to need a variety of mana. And this is a land that comes into play untapped and without any damage to you, gives you mana of one of the colors, which makes Exotic Orchard an ideal candidate for a deck that wants all 5 colors. Like for instance, if you're going to play Maelstrom Archangel, then Exotic Orchard always produces the right color. And if your deck uses has a use for either red or white mana, then, and typically people who don't make red mana do make blue mana. So it is nice that that the Exotic Orchard can rely, like you can also look at it as sort of a red or blue, you know? Which, the nice thing about Exotic Orchard is that it almost always casts Cruel to mana. But I think you really just want to be using all 5 colors. As far as the Scattershot Archers go, I think that some things to look at with that are Ranger of Eos and just having some compelling reason why little creatures would be good. You know, some way to pump them up or Doran. But, alright.
Alright, cool. Unfortunately, the next group's got to come in here,
Yep.
so do something, give that away. Dance, whatever you need to do.
Dance.
Dance, little man,
Alright,
dance.
first of all, who would like to have a playmat? Alright, so let's see. I will do a question from my days in design. Trivia, you said you were asking about the figure second ability?
Yeah.
Who can say what the what was Disciple of the Vault's casting cost originally?
3.
Black 2.
B.
Double black.
Black Rose.
Yeah, who said black Carlos? Yes, it was a Carlos and a black. Not particularly tricky question.
Yeah. Good beans.
I always like the fatties.